Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesies rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, and folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Change that. So there's a man who is out walking on a gorgeous, lovely day, just strolling through the woods, when suddenly, from behind him in the bushes, he hears a crashing. He turns around just in time to see a bear beginning to chase him. Now, the man does what any of us would do and immediately scrambles up a tree. Unfortunately, the tree he's climbing up, the branch snaps, and he falls right back down directly into the bear's arms. And he does what any of us would do that come naturally to us at that moment. He begins to pray. "Dear God, make this bear a Christian bear and deliver me from my end. And if this bear may not be a Christian bear, make my end come swiftly." Well, now, the bear stops, puts the man down at his feet, puts his big bear paws together, looks towards heaven and says, "Dear Lord, thank you for the bounty with which I'm about to receive." Now, ironically, the bear was indeed a Christian, although it did not change the outcome for that man or the situation that the man was in. The important part is that both used the rituals ingrained in them for faithful living: prayer at death and prayer at a mealtime. These rituals are so important. We all use them, but we should always be mindful that when we use a ritual, we are pointing to God and God's nature and not striving our own purposes or our own need to survive. Ritual is essential in life. That's obvious. National, religious, or familial, rituals offer us the comfort of repetition and familiarity as they lend beauty to what we would otherwise call mundane. Think of a little child who asks for the same story night after night. It's not that they don't know the story. They just want to hear it again and become a part of it. And that is their ritual. Think of your own delight in keeping the Christmas rituals as you remember them from your childhood. And all of us have rituals we remember and cherish. Now, some are simply habits. Others are beloved and precious because they are tied to memories of love and affection from our earliest years. And a few of the rituals, like the Eucharist, are holy and sacred indeed. Those that are mere habits may easily be forgotten or ignored, but those that are truly enveloped in memories of love or sacredness are indispensable. And our lessons today centered around such a ritual. But as always, with Jesus, it comes with strings attached. Now, while the crowds love Jesus, the authorities are a little more critical. The issue here is not found in the Torah, but it is a tradition of the elders, meaning it was established by those who came before Jesus and who were considered the elders, the wise ones. And it requires a ritual washing of hands prior to eating. Now, Jesus does not observe this tradition of the elders. So it's natural for the critics, for the elders and those in charge, to want to ask this good Jew why he is not following in the rituals and traditions of his elders. Now, Jesus does not actually answer the question. Instead, he locates the question. Observing traditions are pointless unless they lead to transformed behavior. And he starts saying it's so easy to be focused on ritual practice because observing the real commandments of God or the divine are hard to do. And Jesus, in Jesus' own ways, offers a deeper question of what makes the heart unclean. It's not the food that passes through the body. Instead, it is the dispositions that form inside a human heart that creates the problem. For this disposition is the source of human inclinations to egotism, selfishness, and cruelty. And it most certainly can be found throughout the entire arch of human history. While the early church was in its infancy in learning the words and actions of Jesus, at the same time the church sought to teach these learnings with the habits and the rituals it established. St. Paul introduces or interprets many of them. Now, later on, the Roman Catholic Church will make rituals so paramount that even salvation will be bought through supposed good words and indulgences while the poor people continue to starve. A little while later, the Protestant Church begins to emerge in the beginning of the Reformation. And rightfully so, it attempts to correct these misdirections. Instead, it focuses on the passage that glorify faith, or what came to be called justification by faith. But soon, those inclinations snuck in. And those new traditions and rituals found ways to misinterpret Paul and the early church so that slavery was justified, the denigration of women and children into a lower status was perpetuated, and many, many wrongdoings and injustices towards the poor or the marginalized were ignored. And rather than practicing a spirituality that changed from them through grace, many sought to impose an ideology that made other people conform to their hard and fast principles. It didn't end there. Much of this practice still continues today. We can see it in very obvious places. Think about the terms we hear loosely thrown around by some people who openly practice hypocrisy to the gospel. We hear terms like, at the same time, beating their chest, real Christian, real Christian. And they use that term to qualify who they consider to be fit their definition, overlooking that at its heart, Christianity in the most basic elements seek to live into what the gospel calls us. And I say basic because it is the very foundation of our relationship with God. Calls to worship God above all else. Calls to love our neighbors as ourselves. And the consistent and persistent call for us to routinely worship and be an open community together. Open community together. Non-exclusion. Love our neighbors does not qualify who that neighbor is. It is neighbor. And personally, I am immediately skeptical of anyone who declares that they are a Christian when it is clear they are only doing so to suit their purposes or to drive an agenda, as if being Christian unequivocally makes them trustworthy. Think about all the people we see or hear on TV saying, I am a Christian, so buy my product. Their rituals don't focus on heaven's purpose, but their own power, control, and wealth. Question them. Because right now there is an interesting debate happening around the tragic suffering and destruction as we pull our troops out of Afghanistan. We are hearing vicious things from those who proclaim to be Christian, like we should only care about Americans. Or the one that really upsets me, those who are suffering are Muslim. Their religion, not our religion, not our problem. We hear elected officials and political pundits who claim to be experts on everything, using the new ritual of pointing fingers and placing blame on opponents to score some cheap points. Yet very few of those officials or so-called experts are looking beyond the problems for ways to work together and to find solutions. Very few of them are actually living into what the Christian gospel calls us to do. And why should they? Their ritual of complaining and blaming gets us to pay more attention to them and validates their own self-importance. Meanwhile, those looking and hoping to flee the real problems over there are simply seeking what Jesus already tells us to offer them: compassion, acceptance. It is in our instructions of faith of striving for justice and peace among all people and respecting the dignity of every human being. Now, we do proclaim this in our baptismal ritual. When we use our religion to proclaim we are better than those who believe differently or look differently from us, then that our religion gives us the right to tell others how to act or think, we are forgetting the very basic reason for worshiping and praying. We are forgetting that Jesus teaches us over and over and over again how to love our neighbors as ourselves and preserve the dignity of all others. Jesus does not ask us or teach us to conquer and beat others down and tell them to do as we say and not as we do. Jesus also tells us that we come to church for many reasons besides just having something to do. Because let us not forget that Jesus criticized a portion of his own community for paying lip service to God, exalting human laws and precepts, and abandoning divine commandments. Like a laser that only Jesus can aim, he cut through the real issue because their hearts are far from God. And so when we consider how we engage ourselves in the problems of the day, we must also consider the true purpose of Christian devotion. The entire design of Christian devotion, all of it, everything from the Lord's Prayer and the Great Litany, the rosaries and the revivals, the prayer book and the hymnal, the icons and the incense, the Bible studies, the Sunday schools, the silent retreats, the tent revivals, gospel music and Gregorian chant, public liturgy and private prayer, sacraments, sermons, holy water, holy rolling, all giving thanks at a birth, praying at a death, or giving thanks for a meal that just fell into your hands. The entire approach of Christian devotion, in its diversity and complexity, serves one great overreaching purpose: that Scripture and tradition explain the core of the human person and the relationship with God. Because Christian devotion is meant to help us gain and maintain a new heart, a heart of flesh rather than a heart of stone, a heart that is alive and not dead, a heart that is compassionate and not selfish, a heart that is hospitable, not judgmental, and not dismissive. Christian devotion in its myriad forms is all about softening the heart, preventing it from becoming hard, keeping it tender, keeping it praying. It's about, in a spiritual sense, what a cardiologist would love for all of us to have: a healthy heart. This morning, Jesus is asking the people to think of what is more important: the ritual of washing or the feeding of those who are hungry. Is compassion more important than ritual? So what matters to us? The arguments we have among us as we interpret certain passages in scriptures and their meanings, or the love that undergirds all of the Gospels as we discuss them, and as we discuss and approach our differences from one another. Because one thing that we get hung up on is that we forget that difference and diversity is perfectly normal and okay. Since the days of Babel, we have been encouraged to be a people of diversity. And yet, we ignore this, because the arguments we have sometimes forget the gospel we are given. So what matters to us in these crazy times, such as what is going on after 20 years of continuous war in Afghanistan? Is it the earning of votes, or maintaining an audience and keeping them enraged, or having integrity to act and show compassion? The world has drastically changed since the early days of Jesus, and we have changed very little along with it. The difference is now that we have too much to eat and worry about the pounds that are added instead of the unkindness that emerges from our mouth. We don't seem to care about that unkindness element that emerges from the mouths of others. In church, we too risk hiding behind ritual and fall into it all too easy to ignore what is difficult to obey. And I don't say this as someone who is biased. I am. But the rituals of the Episcopal Church are absolutely gorgeous. They are beautiful. Rather we do a very low church approach or a very high church approach, they are designed to be beautiful and meaningful and accepting. And it's full of meaning. And our Book of Common Prayer is richly filled with prayers. But so often we leave church and go back to our mundane lives. And some of us let ourselves get sucked right back into the anger and idleness of others. So how can we become doers of the world, as James talks about in his lesson this morning? As we hold on to the words we heard or uttered in church, how do we become the doers? Now, it's no surprise, and it's no mystery, that Jesus surrounded himself with disreputable people, perhaps because he saw in their hearts a true longing to love God and obey God's commandments and to be with God. And it is equally no surprise that he reserves some of his most harshest criticisms and some of his most bitter comments for those who were respectable, who performed religious rituals flawlessly, but at the same time had no compassion left in their hearts for everyone who was different from themselves or maybe observed different rituals. So he said to them, in pain, "You abandon the commandments of God to hold on to human traditions." Are we worried? Are we worried this can be said about us, or that it can ever be said about us? Is this our concern? I hope not.